Have you ever wondered what the first method of execution was? Well, you'd have to travel back to the Stone Age to find out. In these early days of humanity, before the advent of written laws or formal courts, punishment was primal and visceral. One of the oldest forms of execution, indeed, was a method known as bludgeoning. This involved an accused individual, perhaps suspected of betrayal or serious crimes, being beaten to death with rudimentary weapons, often stones or wooden clubs. There were no trials, no cross-examinations or pleas for leniency. Instead, there was only raw communal judgment, a collective decision to punish an alleged wrongdoer. This brutal punishment method was as simple as it was savage, reflecting the harsh realities of life in a time before modern civilization. This was the beginning of a long and brutal history of human punishment methods. Now let's journey to ancient Egypt, where nature played a cruel part in their execution methods. In this land of pharaohs and pyramids, punishment was often tied to the forces of nature. The Nile River, a source of life and prosperity for the Egyptians, could also be a conduit for death. Criminals, particularly those convicted of grave offenses, were sometimes thrown into the Nile. Once in the water, they were left to the mercy of the river's most feared predator, the crocodile. This was not just a death sentence but a spectacle, a chilling display of the power and cruelty of the natural world. But if the river didn't claim the condemned, the desert might. Some criminals were abandoned in the unforgiving desert, far from any oasis or shelter. Here, the elements were their executioner. The scorching sun, the relentless heat, the lack of food or water, all these factors conspired to kill slowly, mercilessly. It was a death sentence that could take days, even weeks, to carry out, a grim reminder of the harsh and unforgiving nature of the desert. These methods of execution were not just about punishment, they were also about control, about instilling fear. They served as a stark reminder of the consequences of defying the laws of the land. The ancient Egyptians certainly had a chilling way of combining nature and justice. From the Nile's banks, we move to ancient Mesopotamia, where a fiery death awaited some criminals. The region was governed by Hammurabi's Code, one of the earliest known legal systems. This set of laws, carved into stone for all to see, laid out punishments that were as hard as the stone itself. Among the most horrifying sentences was death by burning. This method was not random but tied to specific crimes, often those involving betrayal or offenses against the gods. The condemned would be bound and placed on a pile of wood or straw. The pyre was then set ablaze and the unfortunate person was consumed by the inferno, a spectacle for all to witness. The use of fire was symbolic. It was seen as a purifying force, reducing the person and their sins to ashes. Through this, Hammurabi's code aimed to deter potential offenders and maintain social order. This was an era where the flames of justice burned quite literally. Next, we find ourselves in ancient Rome, known for its iconic and brutal method of execution. The Romans, masters of spectacle and control, devised a means of punishment that was as public as it was painful: crucifixion. Crucifixion was an execution method that turned the victim's body into a billboard of deterrence. Rebels, slaves, criminals, and even those who dared to challenge the Roman rule were subject to this brutal form of execution. It was a public display of the mighty power of Rome and a stark warning to those who might dare to defy it. But how exactly was crucifixion carried out? Well, victims were first scourged, a brutal form of whipping that would leave the back raw and bleeding. Then they were forced to carry the heavy crossbeam of their own cross to the execution site. Once there, they were nailed or tied to the cross, which was then raised upright. The victims were left hanging, exposed to the elements and the jeering crowds. Death came slowly, often over several days, from a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and the sheer agony of their wounds. And so the cross, now a symbol of hope and salvation for many, was once a symbol of Roman power and a terrifying instrument of torture. The cross was more than a symbol, it was a stark reminder of Roman justice. As we move east to ancient China, we encounter a method of execution that was as much psychological as it was physical. This chilling form of capital punishment was known as lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This method was reserved for the most severe crimes against the state, crimes that were seen as direct affronts to the societal order and harmony. The name lingchi itself paints a vivid picture of the punishment. The literal translation is slow slicing, or lingering death. The aim was not simply to kill, but to serve as a warning to others, a deterrent broadcast in the most gruesome way possible. Lingchi was not a swift execution. It was a methodical, calculated, and prolonged process of death meant to inflict maximum suffering. The convicted person would be tied to a wooden frame in a public area, their impending doom laid bare for all to see. The executioner, armed with a sharp knife, would then begin the meticulous process of removing pieces of the victim's body. The cuts were carefully planned and executed to prolong life and therefore the agony. The psychology of lingchi was as significant as the physical torment. The slow public nature of the execution, the anticipation of each cut, the knowledge of the inevitable outcome all played a part in the mental torture. It was a punishment designed to degrade, to dehumanize, and to demonstrate the absolute power of the state. While it's difficult for us to fathom such a brutal form of punishment today, it's crucial to remember that this method was a product of its time, reflecting the values, beliefs, and fears of ancient Chinese society. It was a grim reminder of the lengths humans can go to maintain order and control. Lingchi was a testament to the chilling creativity humans can exhibit when it comes to punishment. This execution method, as horrific as it was, serves as a stark reminder of the dark corners of our shared human history. Now, we travel to medieval Europe, where the wheel of justice was a literal and horrifying reality. In this era, one of the most brutal forms of execution was the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. This method was not just a means to end life, but a spectacle designed to instill fear into the hearts of the onlookers. The breaking wheel was an imposing large wooden wheel similar to a wagon wheel and was often used in public squares to maximize its visibility. The condemned person was tied to this wheel, their body stretched out along its spokes. Then, an executioner would use an iron bar or hammer to smash their limbs, breaking the bones in multiple places. The sheer force of the blows rendered the limbs useless, and the broken bones were then woven through the spokes of the wheel. But the torment didn't end there. After the breaking, the wheel, with the victim still attached, was often hoisted onto a pole. There, the condemned would be left to die a slow, agonizing death from dehydration, exposure, or their injuries. This method was not only physically torturous, but it also served a psychological purpose. The breaking wheel was a stark reminder of the consequences of defying the law, a cruel display of power, meant to instill fear and maintain control. From Europe, we journey to the Viking Age, where a legendary and horrifying execution method was said to have been used. This method, the blood eagle, is steeped in mystery and legend. It is said to have been reserved for the most despised enemies and traitors. The process was gruesome. The victim's back was sliced open. Then, according to some accounts, their ribs were severed from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings. This brutal transformation was not the end. The torment continued, with salt being rubbed into the wounds, causing agonizing pain. The blood eagle was not just about death, it was about dominance, instilling fear, and demonstrating power. It was a spectacle of brutality that has left a haunting impression on history. As we delve deeper into these dark methods of execution, we see how each reflects the culture and values of its time. The blood eagle was a symbol of Viking brutality and a terrifying spectacle of power. Heading to feudal Japan, we encounter a method of execution that was as slow as it was agonizing. In the rigid and hierarchical society of the time, maintaining order was paramount, and the punishment for crimes against the state often came in the form of brutal execution methods. One such method was being boiled alive. This was not a swift death. It was drawn out, painful, and often carried out in public to serve as a horrifying spectacle and a stern warning to the populace. The process was as straightforward as it was gruesome. The condemned would be placed into a large cauldron, either of water or oil. The heat would then be gradually increased until the liquid reached boiling point. The intense heat would cause severe burns, leading to a slow and agonizing death. The condemned person's suffering was prolonged, their screams serving as a chilling reminder of the power of the state and the consequences of disobedience. This method was primarily reserved for criminals or enemies of the state, their public demise serving as a stark warning to others. In a society where honor and duty were held in the highest regard, the threat of such a harrowing death was a powerful deterrent. This method served as a grim reminder of the consequences of opposing the state. Moving to the colonial era, we encounter an execution method that was as much about spectacle as it was about punishment. We're talking about drawing and quartering, a form of execution especially used in England for those unfortunate souls convicted of high treason. The term drawing and quartering might sound vague, but the reality was horrifically precise. The condemned person was drawn, tied to a horse, and dragged through the streets to the place of execution. This was not just a means of transportation, but a humiliating parade designed to degrade the criminal in the public's eye. Once at the gallows, the quartering part of the sentence would begin. The convicted was hanged, but not to the point of death. Just when they were on the brink of the abyss, they were cut down, only to face the next terrifying stage. They were then disemboweled and beheaded, their bodies subsequently chopped into 4 parts. These gruesome acts were not just for the sake of violence. They were a deliberate, calculated demonstration of the crown's power. Each step was a symbol, a message to the masses. This is what happens when you challenge the king. This brutal method was a stark display of power, meant to deter any thoughts of treason. Finally, we arrive at the 20th century, where execution methods evolved but did not become any less terrifying. In the shadow of this era, 2 chilling methods of execution came to the forefront: gas chambers and firing squads. These methods, while differing greatly in their execution, both represent a disturbing evolution in the machinery of death. Gas chambers, a horrifying creation predominantly associated with the Holocaust, were used by the Nazis during World War II to murder millions of innocent people. This method involved sealing victims inside an airtight chamber where poisonous or asphyxiant gas was introduced. The victims died from hypoxia, the lack of oxygen, or poisoning. The idea behind this cold, calculated method was to create a sanitized form of mass murder, far removed from the personal and visceral nature of traditional methods. On the other hand, firing squads, a method as old as firearms themselves, saw a resurgence in the 20th century. This method, typically used for military or political executions, involved a group of soldiers or law enforcement officers shooting the condemned person simultaneously. The idea was to distribute the moral responsibility of the act among the members of the squad. It was seen as more humane and quick, but it was no less brutal. These methods, though vastly different, both reflect a disturbing trend in the 20th century: the industrialization and depersonalization of death. They show how even as our societies became more civilized, our capacity for cruelty and inhumanity didn't just persist, it evolved. The 20th century showed us that even in our modern era, the dark side of human judgment and punishment persists. While we've made strides in our understanding of justice, these brutal methods of execution serve as a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink in the name of law and order. As we have seen, execution methods have evolved over time, reflecting the values and fears of each era. From the primal bludgeoning of the Stone Age, where raw communal judgment reigned, to the highly orchestrated and public spectacles of ancient Rome and medieval Europe. We saw how execution methods became even more chillingly inventive in ancient China and feudal Japan, and how the Vikings turned execution into a terrifying ritual. In the colonial era, the power of the crown was demonstrated through gruesome spectacles, while the 20th century saw the mechanization of death in the form of gas chambers and firing squads. These methods of execution, while horrifying, provide a window into humanity's past. They show us how societies have used fear and punishment as tools of control, and how, even in our most civilized eras, brutality can lurk beneath the surface. These brutal methods serve as a stark reminder of the lengths humanity can go in the name of justice or control.